Between March and November of 1845, 4 plantation owners across Henrico County, Virginia, died in accidents involving their cotton presses. Each death was ruled misfortune by local coroners, but there was a pattern investigators chose not to see. Every victim weighed over 300 pounds. Every incident occurred when only one enslaved worker was present, and every death involved a field hand whose name appeared in ledgers simply as Elijah. What the official reports never mentioned, witnesses heard screaming that lasted far longer than any accident should allow. The cotton presses required deliberate, sustained operation to achieve the crushing force that killed these men. And in the weeks before each death, enslaved people began singing a spiritual that ended with the words, "The press gonna set you free." Before we continue with the story of Elijah and the calculated justice that swept through Virginia's plantation country, hit that subscribe button right now and drop your state or city in the comments. I want to know how far this forbidden story travels. The impossible strength expanded. Henrico County, Virginia, in the spring of 1845 existed in the peculiar contradiction that defined the antebellum South, a society that claimed Christian virtue, while building its prosperity on the systematic brutalization of human beings it refused to acknowledge as human. The county's 32 operating plantations produced cotton, tobacco, and the carefully maintained fiction that the institution of slavery was both natural and benevolent. Along the banks of the James River, white columned mansions rose like monuments to theft, each one proclaiming its owner's superiority through Greek Revival architecture that required dozens of enslaved hands to maintain. The fields stretched in geometric precision, row upon row of cotton plants that represented not agricultural achievement, but the conversion of human suffering into commodity value. Among the 1,847 enslaved people working these lands, there existed stories that white owners dismissed as superstition, tales of a man whose strength exceeded normal human capacity, who could lift what 3 men struggled with, who had survived punishments that should have killed him. The enslaved spoke of him in careful whispers during the brief hours between labor and sleep, in the coded language that allowed them to communicate truth under the surveillance of those who claimed to own even their words. They said he had been sold from plantation to plantation, always moving, never staying long enough for the white owners to understand what his presence meant. They said his back bore scars that formed a map of every cruelty the system could devise, a living chronicle of whip and brand and chain. They said he never spoke unless necessary, that his eyes held something the overseers could not quite identify but instinctively feared. The white planters laughed at these whispered legends, never considering that what they called superstition might actually be warning. In their estimation, enslaved people were incapable of the sophisticated thinking required for deliberate, calculated resistance. They believed their own propaganda about docile contentment, convinced themselves that the absence of open rebellion meant acceptance of their condition. They measured strength in the crude metrics of cotton bales lifted or fields plowed, never considering that true strength might manifest in patience, in the ability to wait years for the perfect moment, in the discipline to turn suffering into purpose rather than despair. The cotton presses that stood in processing barns across Henrico County were monuments to mechanical efficiency, massive constructions of wood beam and iron screw that could compress 500 pounds of raw cotton into dense bales suitable for shipping to northern textile mills. Operating these presses required knowledge of leverage and force distribution, an understanding of how sustained pressure applied through the screw mechanism could transform loose material into compact form. The enslaved men trained to operate these presses learned through demonstration and repetition, their education informal but comprehensive. They learned where to position the cotton, how to turn the great wheel that drove the screw mechanism, how to judge when sufficient compression had been achieved. They learned, though their teachers never articulated it, that the same mechanism designed to compress cotton could compress anything placed beneath its plate. What the white plantation owners never considered as they watched their cotton presses operate with mechanical precision was that the men they forced to work this machinery were learning lessons beyond cotton compression. They were learning that force, properly applied, was irresistible. They were learning that machinery, once set in motion, continued its work regardless of what lay beneath it. The first death, Marcus Pemberton, expanded. Marcus Pemberton stood 5 feet 8 inches tall and weighed an estimated 340 pounds in March of 1845, and his girth, a testament to the excess his plantation afforded him, while those he enslaved survived on minimal rations, designed to sustain labor without encouraging strength. His body was a living monument to the inequality built into every aspect of plantation life, the physical manifestation of a system that concentrated nourishment and comfort among the few while extracting maximum effort from the many. Pemberton dressed in fine broadcloth despite the Virginia heat, his clothing custom-tailored to accommodate his substantial frame, each garment costing more than the annual value of food provided to the people who generated his wealth. On March 17th, Pemberton entered his cotton processing barn to inspect the mechanical press, a massive apparatus of wood and iron that compressed raw cotton into dense bales for shipping. The structure dominated the barn's interior, its great wooden beams rising 15 feet to support the iron plate that descended when the mechanism was operated. The press itself was a feat of mechanical engineering by 1845 standards, capable of generating tremendous force through the multiplication of effort provided by its screw design. A single man turning the operating wheel could produce pressure that would have required dozens of men pushing directly, the mechanical advantage transforming sustained rotation into crushing compression. Pemberton brought with him a newly acquired field hand named Elijah, purchased 3 weeks prior from a failing plantation in North Carolina. The sale had been unremarkable, conducted at a Richmond auction house where enslaved people were examined like livestock and sold to the highest bidder. The auctioneer had emphasized Elijah's exceptional physical strength, demonstrating his value by having him lift weights that other men struggled with. Pemberton had paid $200 above market rate, judging the investment worthwhile for a worker who could handle the heaviest plantation labor. The previous owner had been eager to sell, offering no explanation for why he was disposing of such valuable property beyond vague references to economic necessity. What happened in that barn over the next 20 minutes would later be described by the county coroner as a regrettable mechanical accident, but the physics of cotton press operation told a different story. The field workers who eventually entered the barn, after the screaming had finally stopped, found Marcus Pemberton beneath the press plate, his body compressed to a thickness that made identification difficult despite his distinctive size. The press wheel stood in its final position, the screw mechanism fully engaged, suggesting that someone had operated it to maximum compression. Elijah sat against the barn wall, his expression vacant, his hands bearing the calluses and marks consistent with having gripped the operating wheel with sustained force. The county sheriff arrived within hours, accompanied by the local magistrate and a doctor who served as informal coroner for deaths requiring official documentation. They examined the scene with the thoroughness that property damage of this magnitude demanded. Marcus Pemberton had been a man of substantial wealth and social standing, his death requiring explanation that would satisfy his family and reassure other plantation owners that no systemic threat existed. The investigation lasted approximately 40 minutes. Elijah was questioned briefly, his testimony simple and direct. Master Pemberton had been inspecting the press mechanism when mechanical failure caused sudden compression. Elijah had tried to reverse the wheel but lacked the strength to overcome the mechanism once fully engaged. The explanation satisfied the authorities because it allowed them to avoid conclusions they found unacceptable. The alternative, that an enslaved man had deliberately murdered his owner using plantation machinery, required acknowledging capabilities and motivations that contradicted the fundamental premises of their social order. The Mechanical Impossibility expanded. The cotton press that killed Marcus Pemberton operated through a screw mechanism that required continuous manual rotation to generate crushing force, a process that typically took 3 to 4 men working in coordination to compress a cotton bale to shipping density. The mechanical principles were straightforward. understood by anyone familiar with screw presses or similar devices. The operator turned a large wheel connected to a vertical screw that descended through a fixed nut assembly, the rotation translating into downward force, applied to the press plate that rested atop the material being compressed. The mechanical advantage was substantial but not magical. Every rotation of the wheel moved the plate downward by the distance of the screw's thread pitch, approximately 1/4 inch per revolution for presses of this era. For a human body to be crushed by such a press, someone would need to operate the mechanism deliberately, continuously, and with full knowledge of what was occurring. The compression that killed Marcus Pemberton would have required approximately 80 to 100 full rotations of the operating wheel, a process demanding sustained physical effort over a duration of 15 to 20 minutes. There was no mechanism for rapid descent, no stored energy waiting to release, no possibility of sudden catastrophic failure that could explain the injuries Pemberton sustained. Every increment of crushing force had to be generated through deliberate human action at the operating wheel. The coroner's report claimed Pemberton had been inspecting the press when mechanical failure caused sudden compression, but cotton press mechanics of the 1,840 seconds contained no springs, no stored energy, no mechanism for sudden autonomous movement. The press descended only when someone turned the wheel. It stopped when the turning stopped. To reverse its direction required turning the wheel in the opposite direction, a process that was actually easier than compression because it involved lifting the plate rather than forcing it downward against resistance. Any operator who accidentally began compressing a human body could have stopped and reversed the process within seconds, long before fatal injuries occurred. The physical evidence at the scene contradicted the official explanation in ways the coroner chose not to document. The operating wheel bore handprints in the dust and oil that coated its surface, prints consistent with sustained grip by someone who had operated the mechanism to full compression. The press plate itself showed no signs of mechanical failure, no broken components or sheared pins that might explain sudden descent. The screw mechanism was fully engaged, meaning someone had operated it through its complete range of motion. Most damning, though never mentioned in official reports, were the marks on the barn's wooden support posts, deep gouges at shoulder height, where someone had apparently braced themselves to generate the leverage needed to continue turning the wheel as resistance increased during the final stages of compression. Several enslaved workers from neighboring properties later testified, in conversations the white authorities never recorded, that they had heard screaming from Pemberton's cotton barn for a duration that seemed impossible if death had occurred through mechanical accident. Screaming suggested consciousness, suggested the victim had time to understand what was happening, to plead or threaten or bargain. Screaming that continued for 15 or 20 minutes suggested something far more terrible than accident. It suggested someone operating the press wheel with deliberate slowness, maintaining the compression rate at a level that maximized suffering while preventing the quick loss of consciousness that might have come from rapid crushing. The white establishment of Henrico County faced the physical evidence and chose collective delusion over uncomfortable truth. To acknowledge that the press had been operated deliberately, that an enslaved man possessed the mechanical knowledge and physical capability to weaponize plantation machinery, would require admitting that the people they claimed to own were capable of sophisticated planning and execution. It would require acknowledging that their system of control rested on a foundation more fragile than they admitted, that the appearance of docility masked capabilities their entire social structure was designed to deny. The song that traveled, expanded. 3 days after Marcus Pemberton's death, enslaved workers on the neighboring Whitfield plantation began singing a spiritual during their evening quarters gathering, a song that none of the white overseers recognized despite their claims of knowing all the Negro hymns. The melody was somber, almost funeral in its cadence, but the words carried something that made the plantation's head overseer uncomfortable enough to report it to his employer. The song emerged from the quarters as the sun descended, and voices joining in the call and response pattern that characterized much of the musical tradition the enslaved community maintained, despite every effort to control or eliminate their cultural practices. The lyrics were deceptively simple, constructed in the biblical language that white listeners expected from enslaved people's religious expression, but carrying meanings that operated on multiple levels. The press of God is patient, the press of God is slow, but it grinds exceeding heavy, and it crushes pride below. The overseer could not articulate why these words disturbed him, only that the enslaved people sang them with an intensity that felt less like worship and more like prophecy. He noted that the singers emphasized certain words with peculiar force, that they held eye contact with each other in ways that suggested shared understanding of meanings beyond the surface text. The spirituals spread with remarkable speed across Henrico County's enslaved population, passing from plantation to plantation through the informal networks that allowed information exchange, despite white surveillance designed to prevent exactly such communication. Within 2 weeks of Pemberton's death, field workers across 8 different plantations were singing variations of the press song, each version maintaining the core imagery while adapting to local circumstances. Some versions referenced cotton specifically, others spoke more generally of burdens lifted and oppressors brought low. All of them carried the same underlying message to those trained to hear it. Justice could be slow, but it was operating, and it was crushing those who deserved crushing. The white population of Henrico County heard the singing but did not understand it. Their inability to comprehend the layered meanings of enslaved people's communication reflecting their broader failure to recognize the humanity and intelligence of those they claimed as property. They heard religious expression where the enslaved community was actually engaging in sophisticated information warfare, using the very Christianity that had been imposed upon them as a tool for circulating news of resistance. The biblical language of grinding and crushing, of patience and eventual judgment, provided perfect cover for discussion of literal grinding and crushing, of patient waiting for opportunities to act against oppressors. Several plantation owners, troubled by reports of this new spiritual, consulted their ministers about the theological appropriateness of the lyrics. The ministers, well versed in using selective biblical interpretation to justify slavery, found nothing objectionable in words that spoke of God's judgment against pride and oppression. They reassured the plantation owners that this was simply another example of the enslaved people's natural religiosity, their tendency toward emotional expression of simple faith. The fact that the song had emerged immediately after Pemberton's death was dismissed as coincidence. The fact that it spread with organized efficiency across multiple plantations was attributed to the supposedly imitative nature of the enslaved population. What the white authorities never considered was that the song served multiple functions beyond religious expression. It was memorial and celebration simultaneously, honoring Pemberton's death without openly admitting satisfaction in his demise. It was warning to white listeners who might understand the implications, a signal that the appearance of docility masked deeper currents of resistance. Most importantly, it was communication among the enslaved community itself, a way of sharing information about Elijah's actions and preparing others for what might follow. Those who sang the press song knew they were participating in something larger than music, that their voices were carrying a message of hope and terror. Combined, the promise that the system that crushed them might itself be subject to crushing. The pattern emerges. Harold Wickham. Expanded. Harold Wickham's plantation occupied 2,400 acres along the James River, and Wickham himself occupied considerably more space than his 5'9" frame should reasonably contain. His weight estimated at 320 pounds by those who had helped him into his carriage when his legs could no longer support extended standing. His obesity was legendary across Henrico County, discussed in tones mixing admiration and disgust, depending on the social status of those discussing it. Among the white plantation elite, substantial girth signaled prosperity and success, the body displaying through its excess the wealth that flowed from the labor of others. Among the enslaved population, Wickham's weight represented something different, the visible embodiment of theft, the conversion of their stolen effort into flesh that could barely support its own mass. Wickham's daily routine centered around consumption of meals that required hours to prepare and featured provisions that cost more than the total annual food budget for his entire enslaved workforce of 83 people. His breakfast typically included ham, eggs, biscuits, gravy, fried potatoes, and fruit preserves, quantities sufficient for 4 men of normal appetite. His dinner, served at 2 in the afternoon, featured multiple meat courses with accompanying vegetables, breads, and desserts. His supper was lighter but still substantial. Between meals he consumed sweet cakes and imported candies, drinking wine with a frequency that kept him in a state of mild intoxication most waking hours. On April 29, 1845, Wickham decided to personally supervise the pressing of his season's first cotton harvest, accompanied only by a recently acquired field hand whose name appeared in the purchase ledger as Elijah. Wickham had purchased this worker 3 weeks earlier at a Richmond estate sale, attracted by the combination of exceptional physical strength and the discounted price that suggested the seller's eagerness to dispose of the property. The seller had mentioned in passing that Elijah's previous master had died suddenly, an unfortunate mechanical accident involving the plantation's cotton press. Wickham had not considered this information significant, seeing only the economic opportunity of acquiring valuable labor at below market cost. The cotton barn stood several hundred yards from Wickham's main house, separated by a grove of elm trees that provided shade during summer months but also created acoustic isolation from the manor. When Wickham entered the barn with Elijah that morning, none of the house servants or field workers had direct sight lines to the building. This isolation was typical of cotton processing facilities, which were deliberately positioned to minimize fire risk to primary structures while remaining close enough for convenient supervision. The massive press dominated the barn's interior, its wooden framework rising to support the iron compression plate that hung suspended above the pressing bed. The workers who found Wickham's body 3 hours later reported that his screams had echoed across the plantation for what seemed an impossible duration, but no one had investigated because entering the cotton barn without permission meant the whip. This detail, casually mentioned and never followed up by investigators, revealed the fundamental dynamic that made Elijah's campaign possible. The system of control that plantation owners relied upon, the pervasive fear that kept enslaved people from acting without explicit authorization, created conditions where someone could be tortured to death while dozens of people remained within earshot, paralyzed by terror of punishment should they intervene without permission. When the overseer finally authorized entry to the barn, after Wickham had failed to return for his midday meal and the screaming had long since stopped, they found a scene nearly identical to the one at Pemberton's plantation 6 weeks earlier. Wickham lay beneath the press plate, compressed beyond recognition despite his substantial bulk. The press mechanism was fully engaged, the wheel locked in final position. Elijah sat against the barn wall in the same vacant posture witnesses had described at the previous death, his hands bearing marks consistent with sustained operation of the press wheel. The county sheriff arrived for the second time in 6 weeks to investigate the death of a prominent plantation owner in a cotton press accident. The anatomy of terror expanded. The human body can survive tremendous pressure when applied evenly and briefly, but the cotton press crushed with concentrated incremental force that prolonged the process of death into an experience of maximum suffering. Medical understanding in 1845 was primitive compared to modern knowledge, but any doctor examining Harold Wickham's remains would have recognized that his injuries were consistent with extremely slow compression, the kind that gave the victim full consciousness to experience each stage of skeletal failure, each rupture of internal organs, each moment of escalating agony before death finally came. The time between the first screams heard by field workers and the silence that followed was estimated at between 15 and 25 minutes, a duration that transformed what might have been quick death into prolonged torture. The mechanics of compression death followed a terrible progression that anyone familiar with cotton press operation would understand instinctively, even if they lacked formal medical education. The initial pressure caused intense pain but no immediate fatal damage. The press plate making contact with the victim's body, and beginning to apply force against bone and tissue, designed to resist compression up to certain thresholds. As the operator continued turning the wheel, each rotation adding incremental pressure, the victim would experience the sensation of being slowly buried alive, their chest cavity gradually collapsing inward, their ability to draw breath becoming more restricted with each passing moment. The rib cage typically failed first, individual ribs cracking under pressure that exceeded their structural capacity, each fracture producing sharp pain that added to the overall experience of being crushed. As the ribs gave way, the broken ends were driven inward toward the lungs and heart, lacerating soft tissue and causing internal bleeding that would eventually prove fatal, even if the compression stopped. But the compression did not stop. The operator continued turning the wheel with methodical consistency, maintaining a pace that kept the victim conscious through the maximum duration of suffering, preventing the merciful unconsciousness that might have come from rapid crushing. As pressure increased beyond the point of rib failure, the internal organs began to rupture in sequence, determined by their relative fragility and positioning within the body cavity. The lungs collapsed first, punctured by broken ribs and crushed by external pressure that forced air from the tissue in ways that made breathing impossible. The victim would experience the terror of suffocation, combined with the agony of crushing, fighting for breaths that could not come, while feeling their body literally flattening beneath inexorable force. The heart continued beating for a time even as surrounding tissue failed, pumping blood through vessels that were being systematically destroyed by the compression. The final stage came when the spine itself began to fail, vertebrae cracking under pressure they were never designed to withstand. At this point, if not before, the victim would likely lose consciousness, as nerve damage interrupted the signals between brain and body. Death followed from some combination of blood loss, organ failure, and suffocation, the exact mechanism varying but the result invariable. What remained beneath the press plate bore little resemblance to the human form it had been, the body reduced to a flattened mass that testified to the tremendous force required to achieve such complete destruction. The Invisible Man expanded. Elijah existed in plantation records as a series of transactions and brief physical descriptions, but no document captured the details that might identify him beyond the generalities of male, approximately 35 years of age, exceptional strength, multiple scars, consistent with severe punishment. He had been sold 4 times in 3 years, always moving from plantation to plantation after brief periods of service, always accompanied by vague explanations from his previous owners about incompatibility or unsuitability for the work required. The paper trail of his existence consisted of bill of sale documents that listed him as property, transferring from one owner to another, appraisals that valued his labor capacity while ignoring his humanity, and occasional mentions in plantation ledgers when his work output was recorded. What none of these records mentioned was that each plantation Elijah left experienced the death of its owner within months of his departure, deaths attributed to natural causes or accidents that seemed, individually, unremarkable. A fall from a horse that broke the neck of a South Carolina planter, a fever that carried off a Georgia plantation owner despite the best efforts of local doctors, a drowning in a creek so shallow that the death seemed impossible until alcohol consumption was noted and accepted as explanation. When viewed in isolation, each death appeared unfortunate but explicable. When viewed as a sequence connected by Elijah's presence, a pattern emerged that should have triggered investigation by any authority genuinely interested in truth. The enslaved community across multiple states maintained oral records that filled in gaps the written documentation deliberately ignored. They knew Elijah's actual history, the story of how he had been born free in Pennsylvania, kidnapped at age 12 by slave catchers who forged papers claiming he was escaped property and sold into a system from which there was no legal escape. They knew about his wife and daughter, sold away from him after he attempted escape, their fate unknown to him but likely terrible. They knew about the punishment he had endured for that escape attempt, 200 lashes that left his back a landscape of scar tissue, followed by 6 months in chains doing the hardest labor the plantation could devise. They knew, though they spoke of it only in the most trusted company, that Elijah had transformed his suffering into purpose rather than allowing it to destroy him. He had learned to use the system against itself, understanding that his exceptional strength made him valuable enough to be sold rather than killed when owners found his presence disturbing. He had learned to wait, to identify which owners deserved his particular form of justice, to create deaths that appeared accidental to white authorities invested in maintaining the fiction of enslaved contentment. He had become what the system feared most, an enslaved person who recognized that individual resistance, carefully executed, could achieve results that open rebellion never could. The oral tradition preserved details that written records omitted by design. They told of how Elijah would spend weeks studying each new plantation, learning its routines and vulnerabilities, identifying the moments when he might be alone with his target. They told of how he selected owners based on their particular cruelties, that he was not simply killing at random, but executing a form of justice that targeted those whose treatment of enslaved people exceeded even the horrific norms of the system. The third death, Cornelius Ashworth, expanded. Cornelius Ashworth weighed 358 pounds in the summer of 1845, a fact he announced with pride as evidence of his plantation's prosperity, and his girth, a physical manifestation of the theft of labor that enriched him. While those who created his wealth survived on rations calculated to prevent strength without inducing complete starvation. Ashworth's plantation consisted of 1,800 acres worked by 79 enslaved people, a commercial operation he ran with the efficiency of a man who viewed human beings as machinery, requiring minimal maintenance to produce maximum output. His account books recorded every expenditure with meticulous precision, including the cost of feeding his enslaved workforce, a line item he worked constantly to minimize while simultaneously increasing the quality and quantity of provisions for his own table. Ashworth had purchased a field hand named Elijah in early June, paying premium price for a Negro of unusual strength suitable for the heaviest labor. The purchase had been made at a Richmond auction following the death of the property's previous owner, another plantation man who had died in what was described as an unfortunate drowning incident. Ashworth had examined Elijah with the thoroughness he applied to all significant purchases, checking teeth and muscle tone, asking the seller questions about work capacity and temperament. The responses had satisfied him that this was a valuable acquisition despite the premium price. A worker whose exceptional strength would pay for itself through increased productivity in the cotton fields and processing operations. On July 12th, Ashworth brought this purchase to his cotton processing barn, intending to demonstrate to visiting neighbors the efficiency of his pressing operation. 3 men from adjacent plantations had gathered for what was intended as a social call mixed with business discussion, the kind of informal networking that allowed plantation owners to share information about prices, methods, and management of their enslaved workforces. Ashworth had boasted about his new acquisition, claiming that Elijah could operate the cotton press alone with greater efficiency than most plantations achieved using 3 men in coordination. The visitors had expressed skepticism, and Ashworth had decided to provide proof through demonstration. The neighbors departed before the demonstration began, called away by a messenger who arrived with news that one of their own plantations was experiencing some minor crisis requiring immediate attention. This coincidence, which seemed unremarkable at the time, later struck some observers as suspicious, though no one could identify any actual mechanism by which Elijah might have arranged such perfectly timed intervention. The 3 men rode off, leaving Ashworth alone with his prized new worker in the cotton barn, the massive press standing ready for operation, bales of cotton positioned for compression into the dense forms required for shipping. The screaming they heard an hour later carried across 3 adjacent properties, audible even at considerable distance due to the particular acoustics of the river valley where these plantations were situated. The sound was distinctive enough that field workers stopped their labor to listen, that house servants paused in their duties, that the departed neighbors, now miles away, later claimed to have heard echoes of something terrible on the wind, but no one intervened. No one approached the cotton barn to investigate. The system that maintained plantation discipline through pervasive fear of punishment had created conditions where torture could occur in broad daylight, while dozens of people remained frozen in place, waiting for authorization to act that never came. The investigation that wasn't expanded. By August 1845, 3 plantation owners in Henrico County had died in cotton press accidents within 5 months. A statistical anomaly that should have triggered serious investigation by any authority committed to uncovering truth. The probability of 3 such deaths occurring independently, given that cotton press accidents typically killed fewer than 1 person per year across the entire state of Virginia, it was so vanishingly small that coincidence could be ruled out by anyone capable of basic mathematical reasoning. Instead, county officials conducted the most cursory examinations, accepting without question the testimony of enslaved workers who stated that their masters had died in mechanical accidents while inspecting equipment alone. The white establishment of Henrico County faced a choice that was ultimately about preserving the foundations of their entire social system rather than about discovering truth in individual cases. Investigate thoroughly and potentially uncover evidence of deliberate murder by enslaved people, a discovery that would shatter the fiction of docile contentment they had constructed to justify their entire way of life, or maintain the fiction through willful blindness, accepting implausible explanations rather than confronting implications that threatened everything they believed about their right to own human beings. The choice was never really in doubt. The investigation that should have occurred never began because the results of genuine investigation would have been more threatening to white supremacy than the deaths themselves. The county sheriff, a man named Thomas Bridwell who owed his position to the political support of the plantation elite, interviewed witnesses at each death scene with questions designed to confirm rather than challenge the accident narrative. He asked enslaved workers if they had seen mechanical failure, not whether the press had been operated deliberately. He asked about the victim's position relative to the machinery, not about the duration of time required to achieve the compression that caused death. He documented the scene with sketches and measurements that focused on mechanical details, while ignoring evidence that contradicted the accident explanation, such as the handprints on the operating wheel or the duration of screaming reported by witnesses. The coroner, a doctor named Ezekiel Morrison who served in that capacity as adjunct to his medical practice, performed examinations that were deliberately superficial. He noted cause of death as crushing injuries consistent with cotton press compression, and he noted the absence of any evidence suggesting external violence beyond what the press itself would cause. What he did not note was that the pattern of injuries suggested slow rather than rapid compression, that the mechanical state of the press indicated deliberate operation through its full range of motion, or that the timing of these deaths formed a pattern that transcended coincidence. His reports were accepted by the county magistrate without question, filed away in records that were never cross-referenced to identify patterns that individual cases obscured. The plantation owners themselves, the surviving members of the class that had lost 3 of their number, engaged in collective denial that was partly self-protective and partly ideological. To acknowledge that an enslaved person was systematically murdering owners would require acknowledging that enslaved people possessed intelligence, capability for planning, and justified rage, all of which contradicted the premises that allowed the slave system to function. They preferred to believe in mechanical failure, in coincidence, in anything except the possibility that the people they claimed to own might be waging calculated war against them. Some owners quietly increased security, posting guards near their cotton barns or requiring that enslaved workers never be alone with the pressing machinery, but these precautions were implemented without public acknowledgement of why they had become necessary. The economics of silence expanded. The plantation economy of 1,845 Virginia rested on a foundation of enforced ignorance, a conspiracy of silence where white society collectively agreed not to examine too closely the methods by which their prosperity was generated or the resentment such methods might create among those they enslaved. The system functioned through multiple layers of deliberate blindness. each layer necessary to maintain the psychological coherence required for plantation owners to live with what they were doing. They could not acknowledge the full humanity of enslaved people without admitting that slavery was profound moral evil. They could not acknowledge enslaved people's intelligence without confronting the fact that intelligent beings would naturally resist enslavement. They could not acknowledge the systematic violence of their system without recognizing themselves as perpetrators of ongoing atrocity, rather than benevolent patriarchs caring for inferior beings. To acknowledge that an enslaved person might be systematically murdering plantation owners would require acknowledging that enslaved people possessed the intelligence to plan, the will to resist, and the justified rage to kill their oppressors. Admissions that contradicted every premise of the system. The deaths were therefore attributed to accidents, and the investigation that should have occurred never began because truth was more threatening than murder. The economic implications of honest investigation extended beyond the immediate question of guilt or innocence in specific cases. If word spread that enslaved people were capable of such sophisticated resistance, that they could weaponize plantation machinery and create deaths that mimicked accidents, the entire system would be revealed as more fragile than the white establishment claimed. The value of enslaved people as property depended partly on the perception that they were controllable, that owners could rely on a combination of violence, surveillance, and psychological conditioning to ensure compliance and productivity. Evidence of successful, sustained resistance by an individual who moved from plantation to plantation, executing owners would undermine that perception catastrophically. The market value of enslaved people would decline if purchasers could not be confident in their ability to control their human property. Insurance companies that provided policies against loss of enslaved property through death or escape would raise premiums or refuse coverage entirely. The financial instruments that allowed plantation owners to borrow against the value of their enslaved workforce would become more expensive or unavailable as lenders recognized increased risk. Beyond the immediate economic calculations, exposure of Elijah's campaign would force uncomfortable questions about the moral legitimacy of slavery itself. Northern abolitionists would seize on the story as evidence that enslaved people recognized their condition as intolerable and were willing to risk death to resist it. They would argue that such resistance was natural and justified response to systematic oppression, that anyone held in bondage would naturally seek freedom through whatever means available. They would use Elijah as a symbol of resistance, transforming him from individual killer into representative of justified rebellion against evil system, a narrative that Southern slaveholders desperately needed to prevent from taking hold. The religious justifications that Southern churches had constructed to reconcile Christianity with slavery would face renewed challenge if Elijah's story became widely known. Ministers had worked for decades to develop theological arguments claiming that slavery was biblically sanctioned, that it was part of God's plan for racial hierarchy, that enslaved people who accepted their condition would be rewarded in heaven. But story of an enslaved man executing systematic justice against his oppressors suggested different reading of Christian morality, one where resistance to evil was righteous even when law defined that resistance as crime. The witness who spoke expanded. Among the enslaved population of Henrico County, there existed a man named Samuel, who had been taught to read and write by his previous owner before that owner's financial collapse forced Samuel's sale to the Wickham plantation. Samuel's literacy was unusual and dangerous, a skill that violated laws designed to keep enslaved people ignorant and thus more easily controlled. His previous master had been a merchant of Quaker sympathies who believed that all humans deserved education regardless of their legal status, a belief he had acted upon quietly until economic failure forced the sale of his property, including Samuel. The new owner, Harold Wickham, had been unaware of Samuel's literacy when he purchased him, seeing only a strong field hand suitable for cotton labor. Samuel had been present on 3 different plantations that Elijah had passed through, and he had observed patterns that white investigators deliberately ignored. He had seen how Elijah arrived at each plantation, purchased or traded with seemingly routine transaction. He had watched as Elijah spent weeks learning the routines, studying the cotton press operations, positioning himself to be alone with the owner at critical moments. He had witnessed the aftermath of each death, seen how the authorities conducted perfunctory investigations that avoided uncomfortable conclusions. Most significantly, Samuel had spoken with Elijah during the brief periods when they worked in proximity, conversations conducted in careful whispers that revealed Elijah's purpose and method. In late August, Samuel made the dangerous decision to approach a Quaker merchant known to have abolitionist sympathies, carrying with him a document he had written in secret, a chronicle of Elijah's movements and the deaths that followed his presence on each plantation. The document had been composed over weeks, written in stolen moments using materials Samuel had acquired through careful theft from the plantation's administrative office. He used the backs of discarded account papers, writing in cramped script, to maximize the information he could record on limited material. The text detailed dates, locations, names of victims, and the common elements that connected each death: the cotton press mechanism, the isolation of victim and perpetrator, the screaming that lasted impossibly long, the mechanical impossibility of the accidents that authorities accepted as explanation. The merchant, Jonathan Pierce, operated a dry goods store in Richmond and maintained quiet correspondence with abolitionists in Pennsylvania, walking the dangerous line between commercial respectability and moral conviction. When Samuel approached him in the alley behind his store, presenting the document with shaking hands, Pierce recognized immediately the danger both men faced if their meeting were discovered. He read the document by lamplight in his back room while Samuel waited, understanding with each paragraph that he was being handed responsibility for impossible choice. The information Samuel provided was explosive, detailed enough to trigger serious investigation if presented to the right authorities, but also dangerous enough to get both of them killed if it fell into wrong hands. Pierce asked Samuel why he was exposing Elijah, why he would betray someone who was striking back against the system that oppressed them both. Samuel's answer revealed the moral complexity of their situation. He believed Elijah's actions were justified by the evil of slavery, that each plantation owner who died beneath the cotton press had earned that death through their own cruelty. But he also understood that when Elijah was inevitably caught, the white establishment would respond with systematic terror against the entire enslaved population, that innocent people would suffer retribution for Elijah's individual actions. The question was not whether Elijah should be stopped, but whether his exposure might be managed in ways that minimized collective punishment while maximizing attention to the conditions that had created such desperate resistance. The fourth death, Benjamin Rutledge, expanded. Benjamin Rutledge had built his plantation fortune through calculated cruelty, a man who kept meticulous records of each punishment administered to the 67 people he enslaved, documenting whip counts and recovery times with the detached precision of a scientist conducting experiments on subjects he did not consider fully human. His leather-bound punishment ledger occupied a prominent position on his study desk, filled with entries that recorded infractions, punishments decided, and outcomes observed. A field hand who failed to meet cotton quota received 15 lashes. A house servant who broke china received 10 lashes. An enslaved person who spoke disrespectfully received 25 lashes. The ledger transformed systematic brutality into administrative procedure, violence rendered as bureaucratic routine. Rutledge weighed 312 pounds in September 1845, his substantial frame requiring a custom-built chair for the dining room where he consumed meals that cost more than the annual food budget for his entire enslaved workforce. He took particular pride in his size, viewing it as physical evidence of his success and superiority. His morning routine included weighing himself on a large scale typically used for measuring cotton bales, recording the results in a separate journal where he tracked his weight gain as though it were a business metric indicating prosperity. He discussed his weight openly at social gatherings, comparing himself to other plantation owners and expressing satisfaction when he exceeded them in both acreage owned and pounds carried. When a field hand named Elijah arrived on his plantation via purchase from a Richmond auction house, Rutledge saw only an asset of unusual strength that would increase his cotton processing efficiency. The auction had been held to liquidate the estate of Cornelius Ashworth following his death in what authorities described as a tragic cotton press accident. Rutledge had attended the auction specifically to acquire Ashworth's most valuable property, bidding aggressively against other plantation owners who recognized the same opportunity. He paid $1,100 for Elijah, a premium price that reflected both the worker's exceptional physical capabilities and the competitive bidding atmosphere. Rutledge had examined Elijah with the thoroughness he applied to all major purchases, noting in his acquisition ledger that the worker showed extensive scarring, consistent with severe punishment, a detail Rutledge interpreted as evidence of proper discipline by previous owners. Rutledge's plantation operated according to schedules he had refined over 20 years of slave ownership, routines designed to maximize productivity while minimizing cost of human maintenance. Enslaved workers rose at 4:30 each morning, worked in the fields until noon, received 30 minutes for a meal of cornmeal and salted pork, then returned to labor until darkness made further work impossible. During cotton harvest season, the schedule extended to include night work by moonlight, with enslaved people working in rotating shifts that allowed the harvest to continue without pause. Rutledge monitored this operation from his house or from horseback, carrying a small notebook where he recorded observations about productivity and behavior, information that fed into his punishment decisions. The cotton press at Rutledge's plantation was newer than those on neighboring properties, a mechanical press of improved design that he had purchased the previous year at considerable expense. The machine represented the latest advancement in cotton processing technology, capable of compressing bales to greater density than older models, thus reducing shipping costs and increasing profit margins. Rutledge had personally supervised the installation of the press, studying its operation carefully and training 3 enslaved workers in its use. He took pride in the efficiency of his cotton processing operation, frequently inviting other plantation owners to observe how quickly his workers could transform raw cotton into compressed bales ready for market transport. The calculation expanded. Cotton press mechanics required specific knowledge to operate effectively, understanding of leverage and force distribution that was typically taught to enslaved workers designated for processing duties. The training process involved demonstration of proper technique, explanation of mechanical principles in simplified terms, and supervised practice until operators could work safely and efficiently. For someone to weaponize this machinery, they would need not only the physical strength to operate the press alone, but also the mechanical comprehension to maximize suffering while preventing the quick death that might have allowed the victim to lose consciousness early in the process. Elijah possessed both capabilities. Having worked with cotton presses across multiple plantations and having studied their operation with the focused attention of someone planning to use them for purposes their designers never imagined. The standard cotton press operation involved positioning loose cotton on the pressing bed, lowering the press plate to make initial contact, then turning the operating wheel in steady rotation that gradually compressed the material into dense form. The process typically required 15 to 20 minutes for a standard bale, with 3 to 4 workers sharing the effort of turning the wheel as resistance increased during final compression. The workers learned to pace themselves, to recognize when the bale had reached appropriate density, to coordinate their efforts for maximum efficiency. What they were also learning, though the lesson was never explicitly taught, was exactly how much force the press could generate, and how that force would affect anything placed beneath the plate. What Elijah also possessed, though no white observer would acknowledge it, was a profound understanding of psychological warfare. The screaming served a purpose beyond the victim's agony. It advertised to every enslaved person within hearing distance that justice, however terrible, was being served. The duration of the screaming was calibrated precisely, long enough to ensure that dozens of witnesses would hear and understand what was happening, but not so long that white authorities might overcome their paralysis and intervene. Elijah had learned from experience exactly how long the system's fear-based control mechanisms would keep potential witnesses frozen in place, had tested the limits of that paralysis across multiple plantations, and had refined his method to operate within those constraints. The mechanical knowledge required for Elijah's purpose went beyond simple operation of the press to understanding the relationship between rotation, speed, and compression rate, between applied force and resulting injury. He had learned through observation and experimentation how to maintain the pressing plate's descent at a rate that kept the victim conscious through maximum duration, how to avoid the rapid compression that might have caused swift loss of consciousness through shock or oxygen deprivation. The ideal rate was slow enough to prolong awareness, but fast enough that intervention became unlikely once the process began. A balance that required sophisticated understanding of both machinery and human physiology. The psychological component of Elijah's method was equally calculated. He chose his targets based on their particular cruelties, focusing on plantation owners whose treatment of enslaved people exceeded even the horrific norms of the system. This selectivity served multiple purposes. It ensured that his actions carried moral weight within the enslaved community, that he would be seen as executing justice rather than committing random murder. It provided him with deep personal motivation that sustained him through the terrible work of operating the press while a human being screamed beneath it. And it created a pattern that, once recognized by other plantation owners, might cause them to moderate their behavior out of fear that excessive cruelty marked them as potential targets. The Quaker's dilemma expanded. Jonathan Pierce operated a dry goods store in Richmond and maintained quiet correspondence with abolitionists in Pennsylvania, walking the dangerous line between commercial respectability and moral conviction that defined many Quakers in the South during this period. His store occupied a prominent position on Main Street, a successful commercial enterprise that served both plantation owners and town residents with imported cloth, tools, preserves, and other necessities. Pierce had inherited the business from his father and had built it into one of Richmond's most profitable retail operations through combination of fair pricing, quality merchandise, and the kind of personal service that created loyal customers. His commercial success gave him social standing that protected him from the worst suspicions that might otherwise have fallen on a known Quaker with abolitionist sympathies. Samuel's document presented Pierce with an impossible choice: remain silent and allow the murders to continue, knowing that each death was a form of violent resistance against an evil system, or expose Elijah and potentially trigger a wave of retaliatory violence against the entire enslaved population of Henrico County. Pierce understood from his correspondence with Northern abolitionists that the movement's strategy emphasized moral persuasion and political action over violent resistance, that most abolitionists believed slavery would end through combination of economic pressure, religious awakening, and eventual legislative action. The story of an enslaved man systematically murdering plantation owners contradicted that narrative, providing ammunition for those who argued that enslaved people were dangerous and required strict control for public safety. But Pierce also understood that revealing the truth might result in mass executions, the white establishment responding to deliberate murder by enslaved persons with systematic terror designed to reinforce absolute control. Virginia law permitted execution of enslaved people for crimes ranging from murder to arson to attempted rape of white women, with trials that were typically perfunctory and judgments that prioritized deterrence over justice. If authorities recognized that Elijah had killed 4 plantation owners, they would almost certainly execute him publicly in a manner designed to terrorize the enslaved population into absolute submission. More troubling, they might extend punishment beyond Elijah, to include anyone suspected of knowing about his actions and failing to report them, potentially executing dozens of enslaved people in collective punishment meant to ensure that future resistance would be immediately betrayed by the enslaved community itself. Pierce spent 3 days considering his options, reading and rereading Samuel's document, praying for guidance according to Quaker practice of seeking divine direction through silent contemplation. He understood that doing nothing was itself a choice with moral consequences, that each additional murder that occurred while he remained silent would be partly his responsibility. He understood that exposing Elijah was also a choice with moral consequences, that the retributive violence that would follow might kill more people than Elijah's campaign ever could. The question was not which choice was good, neither was good, but which choice was less evil, which path forward minimized total suffering while maintaining some possibility of eventual justice. The decision Pierce ultimately made reflected both his moral principles and his strategic thinking about how best to advance the abolitionist cause. He would send Samuel's document not to Virginia authorities but to abolitionist contacts in Pennsylvania, letting them decide how to use the information. He would simultaneously send a carefully worded letter to the Virginia governor, not identifying Elijah specifically, but warning that plantation owners in Henrico County faced danger from someone using cotton presses as murder weapons, information that might prompt protective measures without triggering the mass violence that would follow if the full story became public. The Society of Secrets expanded. The enslaved community of Henrico County operated its own network of information exchange, a communication system invisible to white observers who convinced themselves that the people they owned were incapable of organized thought. This network had existed for decades, evolving in response to the control mechanisms plantation owners implemented to prevent communication between properties. Messages traveled between plantations through work details that brought enslaved people from different properties into temporary proximity, through hiring out arrangements where skilled workers moved between plantations for specialized tasks, through the brief interactions at markets and mills, where enslaved people from different properties might encounter each other under white supervision too minimal to monitor actual conversation. The system operated through multiple layers of communication, each designed to maximize information transfer while minimizing risk of exposure. The most basic level involved simple observation and reporting. Workers who traveled between plantations carried news of events, births, deaths, sales, and punishments, maintaining an oral chronicle of the enslaved community's experiences that white authorities never documented. The second level involved coded communication, messages embedded in spirituals, work songs, and casual conversation that appeared innocuous to white observers but carried specific meanings to those trained to hear them. The third level, reserved for the most sensitive information, involved trusted messengers who carried verbal or written messages between specific individuals, accepting the tremendous risk of being caught with evidence that could result in severe punishment or death. By September 1845, substantial portions of the enslaved population knew what Elijah was doing, understood the pattern of his movements, and maintained absolute silence when questioned by white authorities about the cotton press accidents. The information had spread through all three levels of communication simultaneously, creating a shared understanding that transcended individual plantations. Field workers sang spirituals referencing cotton presses and divine judgment, songs that white overseers heard without comprehending their specific meaning. House servants whispered to each other while serving meals, their conversations appearing to be idle gossip but actually conveying precise information about which plantations Elijah had visited and when. Trusted messengers carried detailed accounts between properties, ensuring that the enslaved community maintained better intelligence about Elijah's campaign than the white authorities who were supposedly investigating the deaths. This collective knowledge created profound ethical complexity within the enslaved community. Most recognized that Elijah's actions were a form of resistance against an evil system, that the plantation owners he killed had earned their deaths through their own cruelty and participation in slavery. Many felt satisfaction at news of each death, viewing it as evidence that the seemingly omnipotent power of white slave owners was actually vulnerable to individual action. Some saw Elijah as a hero executing justice that the legal system would never provide, a righteous avenger striking back against oppressors who operated with impunity. But others worried about the collective consequences of his individual resistance, understanding that when he was eventually caught, the white establishment would respond with retribution that extended far beyond punishing the individual responsible. The silence that the enslaved community maintained was not simply passive failure to report information to authorities. It was active choice requiring courage and coordination, a collective decision to protect Elijah's campaign, despite the personal risks such protection entailed. Every enslaved person who heard the press song and understood its meaning who witnessed the aftermath of one of the deaths, who encountered Elijah at market or mill and recognized who he was, made a conscious choice not to report what they knew. The breaking point. Expanded. Violence against enslaved people in 1845 Virginia operated under a legal framework that granted owners nearly absolute power over those they claimed as property, with punishments ranging from whipping to mutilation to murder, all sanctioned by laws designed to maintain white supremacy through systematic terror. The Virginia Slave Code permitted owners to discipline their enslaved workers as they saw fit, with legal protections so minimal as to be effectively non-existent. An owner who killed an enslaved person during the course of administering punishment faced no criminal liability unless prosecutors could prove malicious intent separate from disciplinary purpose, a standard so high that convictions were virtually impossible. The law treated enslaved people as simultaneously human enough to be held criminally responsible for their actions, yet not human enough to receive protection from violence inflicted upon them. The enslaved population survived through combination of outward compliance and inner resistance, maintaining dignity and humanity under conditions designed to strip away both. They developed psychological strategies for enduring daily humiliation without allowing it to destroy their sense of self-worth. They created communities within the quarters that provided mutual support and preserved cultural practices, despite efforts to eliminate their African heritage. They maintained family bonds, even when legal structures refused to recognize enslaved marriages or parental rights. They found ways to resist that fell short of open rebellion but asserted their humanity through small acts of autonomy, working slowly when unsupervised, feigning illness to avoid labor, breaking tools in ways that appeared accidental, stealing food to supplement inadequate rations. Elijah represented something different. Not survival through accommodation, but active retribution, transforming the tools of oppression into instruments of deadly justice. His presence on each plantation disrupted the careful equilibrium of fear that kept the system functioning, the balance between punishment severe enough to ensure compliance, but not so severe as to destroy the enslaved person's ability to work. He demonstrated that individual resistance, carefully planned and ruthlessly executed, could achieve results that collective action never could in a system designed to prevent coordinated rebellion. Each plantation owner crushed beneath the cotton press sent a message to both the enslaved community and to other owners. The appearance of absolute control was illusion. Vulnerability existed even for those who seemed most powerful. The psychological impact of Elijah's campaign extended beyond the immediate deaths he caused. Plantation owners across Henrico County began experiencing anxiety about their own vulnerability, looking at their cotton presses with new awareness of how easily machinery could become a weapon. Some increased security around processing facilities, requiring multiple workers to be present during any operation involving the press. Others restricted which enslaved workers had access to the machinery, limiting operation to those they believed most loyal and least likely to harbor murderous intentions. These precautions acknowledged, without explicitly admitting, that the deaths might not be accidents, that someone might be weaponizing plantation equipment against its owners. Within the enslaved community, Elijah became a figure of complex meaning. To some, he was a hero, embodying the resistance that most could only dream of, but never dare attempt. To others, he was a tragic figure, a man so damaged by the system's cruelty that he had become death's instrument, unable to escape the cycle of violence that slavery perpetuated. The final target. William Thatcher expanded. William Thatcher owned the largest plantation in Henrico County, 4,100 acres worked by 143 enslaved people. A commercial empire built on maximizing cotton production through minimizing cost of human maintenance. His operation was the model that other plantation owners studied, a demonstration of how ruthless efficiency could generate extraordinary profits from slave labor. Thatcher's account books revealed his philosophy. Enslaved people should receive just enough food, clothing, and shelter to maintain working capacity, but no more. Medical care was provided only when the cost of treatment was less than the cost of replacing the worker through purchase. Families were separated whenever financial advantage dictated. Children were put to work as young as age 5, starting with light tasks and progressing to full field labor by age 12. Thatcher himself weighed an estimated 375 pounds. His excessive consumption, a deliberate display of power, demonstrating through his physical bulk the surplus value extracted from those whose labor enriched him. He had custom furniture built to accommodate his size, chairs reinforced with extra bracing, a bed frame constructed of timber massive enough to support his weight without collapsing. His clothing was tailored by enslaved seamstresses, who spent weeks creating garments that fit his enormous frame, work that took them away from other duties, but that Thatcher considered essential to projecting the image of prosperity he cultivated. He moved with difficulty, requiring assistance to mount his horse, and employing a carriage for any journey longer than a few hundred yards, but he considered his immobility a mark of success rather than disability. In October 1845, Thatcher purchased a field hand of exceptional strength from an estate sale, paying top price for an asset he intended to use in his cotton pressing operation. The seller mentioned that the worker's previous owner had died in an unfortunate accident, information that Thatcher dismissed as irrelevant to the value of the property he was acquiring. Thatcher had examined the worker with the thoroughness he applied to all major purchases, testing his strength by having him lift increasingly heavy weights, checking his teeth for signs of age or disease, examining his body for evidence of physical defects that might impair working capacity. The examination had satisfied Thatcher that this was a premium asset worth the premium price, a worker whose exceptional capabilities would generate returns that justified the investment. Thatcher's plantation operated according to systems he had refined over 30 years of slave ownership, procedures designed to extract maximum labor, while preventing the kind of coordinated resistance that required communication between enslaved workers. He rotated work assignments frequently to prevent the formation of strong bonds between workers who might organize collective action. He promoted a hierarchy among the enslaved population, giving privileges to house servants and skilled workers that field hands did not receive, creating divisions that discouraged unity. He employed overseers known for their brutality, men who would enforce discipline without the hesitation that might come from recognizing the humanity of those they supervised. The result was a plantation that ran with mechanical efficiency, producing cotton yields that exceeded those of neighboring properties, while spending less per enslaved worker on maintenance costs. The cotton press at Thatcher's plantation was the newest and most powerful in the county, a machine he had commissioned specifically to handle the large volume of cotton his operation produced. The press could compress bales to greater density than standard models, allowing him to reduce shipping costs through more efficient use of transport capacity. Thatcher had personally supervised the installation, studying every aspect of its operation and ensuring that his workers understood the importance of the machinery to the plantation's profitability. The trap expanded. By November 1845, Jonathan Pierce had made his decision. He sent detailed letters to abolitionist contacts in Philadelphia and to federal authorities in Washington, documenting the pattern of deaths and naming Elijah as the suspected perpetrator, but including crucial context about the systematic violence of slavery that might have motivated such actions. Pierce understood he was likely signing Elijah's death warrant, but he also believed that exposing this story might force a larger reckoning with the moral horror of the slave system itself. He spent considerable time crafting the letters, attempting to present the information in ways that might generate constructive response rather than simply triggering retributive violence against the enslaved community. What Pierce did not anticipate was that his letters would be intercepted by local postmasters who routinely examined correspondence for seditious content. The practice of opening and reading mail was technically illegal but widely employed in southern states, where authorities feared abolitionist propaganda might reach enslaved people or inspire sympathetic whites to action against slavery. The Richmond postmaster, a man named Edward Calloway who held strong pro-slavery views, made a regular practice of examining mail sent to northern addresses, looking for correspondence that might indicate abolitionist sympathy or activities that threatened the slave system. When Pierce's letters passed through his office, Calloway recognized immediately their dangerous content. Rather than forwarding the letters to their intended recipients, Calloway delivered them to local authorities, specifically to the county sheriff and to several prominent plantation owners whose properties had experienced the suspicious deaths. The revelation that someone had documented the pattern of deaths, had identified a specific enslaved person as responsible, and had attempted to alert federal authorities created immediate crisis among Henrico County's white establishment. They understood that if Pierce's information reached Northern abolitionists or federal investigators, the resulting scrutiny would expose not just Elijah's campaign, but the broader context of cruelty and violence that characterized Virginia's slave system. They needed to act quickly to contain the situation before it expanded beyond local control. The decision was made to arrest Elijah immediately, to conduct a swift trial, and to execute him publicly in a manner designed to terrorize the enslaved population into absolute submission. But they also needed to arrest Pierce, to silence the Quaker merchant whose documentation of the deaths threatened to expose truths the white establishment desperately needed to keep hidden. The challenge was crafting charges against Pierce that would justify his arrest without acknowledging the actual content of his letters, since that acknowledgement would require admitting that multiple plantation owners had died under suspicious circumstances that authorities had deliberately failed to investigate. The solution they devised was to charge Pierce with inciting slave rebellion through distribution of seditious literature, a crime under Virginia law that carried severe penalties, including potential execution. The letters he had written would be presented as evidence of his attempt to encourage violent resistance among the enslaved population. Their detailed documentation of Elijah's campaign, reframed as instructions or encouragement for others to follow similar paths. The fact that Pierce had sent the letters to Northern addresses rather than to enslaved people in Virginia was dismissed as irrelevant. The authorities argued that his intent was clearly to promote resistance regardless of the specific recipients of his correspondence. The trap was set with careful coordination. Militia members were dispatched to Pierce's store in Richmond with orders to arrest him and seize any documents or correspondence that might provide additional evidence of abolitionist activities. The Night of Judgment expanded. On November 3, 1845, county militia surrounded William Thatcher's plantation with orders to apprehend an enslaved man named Elijah on suspicion of multiple murders. The operation had been planned with military precision, involving 40 armed men positioned to prevent any possibility of escape. They arrived in darkness, taking positions around the plantation's key structures before dawn revealed their presence. The strategy was to capture Elijah before he could understand what was happening, to overwhelm him with force that made resistance impossible. The militia commander had ordered his men to take Elijah alive if possible, but to shoot without hesitation if he attempted to flee or fight. The white establishment wanted a public trial and execution, the spectacle of legal process demonstrating their control, but they would settle for a corpse if capture proved impossible. What they found transformed their mission from arrest to siege. Elijah had barricaded himself in the cotton processing barn with William Thatcher, the press mechanism already in operation when militia members broke through the door. The massive wooden beams that secured the barn's entrance had been reinforced from inside, requiring axes and crowbars to breach. The sound of wood splintering and men shouting filled the pre-dawn darkness, alerting the entire plantation that something extraordinary was occurring. Enslaved people emerged from their quarters to witness the commotion, held back by guards but close enough to see and hear what followed. Thatcher was alive, pinned beneath the press plate, conscious and screaming, and Elijah stood at the operating wheel with a choice before him: release his victim or complete the killing with witnesses present. The press had been operated to the point where Thatcher was immobilized but not yet fatally crushed, positioned at the precise moment of maximum agony when the victim remained fully conscious but unable to escape. Thatcher's screams echoed through the barn and across the surrounding fields, a sound of pure terror and pain that dozens of witnesses would remember for the rest of their lives. His body was compressed enough that breathing came in shallow gasps, but his lungs still functioned sufficiently to produce the screams that testified to his awareness of his situation. The moment crystallized everything: the rage of enslaved people denied justice through legal means, the horror of white society confronting deliberate retribution, the moral bankruptcy of a system built on violence, suddenly forced to witness its logical conclusion. Militia members stood in the barn's entrance, muskets raised, but they did not fire immediately because their commander wanted Elijah captured alive. The brief hesitation gave Elijah time to speak, his voice carrying across the silent barn with shocking clarity. He did not plead for mercy or attempt to justify his actions. He simply stated facts: the names of the plantation owners he had killed, the specific cruelties each had committed that marked them for death, and his only regret that he could not have killed more before being stopped. Then Elijah made his final choice. He placed both hands on the operating wheel and began turning it with steady, deliberate rotation, continuing the compression, while militia members shouted orders to stop, while Thatcher's screams reached a pitch that seemed impossible for human lungs to produce. The militia commander ordered his men to fire, but the angle was wrong, the risk of hitting Thatcher too high. They rushed forward instead, attempting to physically stop Elijah from turning the wheel. But his strength was extraordinary, and he had positioned himself with mechanical advantage that made dislodging him nearly impossible without killing him. The echo that remained expanded. Elijah was executed by hanging on November 29, 1845, before a crowd estimated at over 500 people, the white establishment using his death as theater designed to reassert control and project absolute power over the enslaved population they claimed to own. The execution was held in Richmond's main square, positioned for maximum visibility to both white and enslaved audiences. Authorities had constructed a gallows of unusual height, ensuring that the condemned man would be visible from considerable distance. They forced enslaved people from surrounding plantations to attend, making their presence mandatory and threatening punishment for any who failed to witness what happened to those who raised their hands against white masters. The message was clear: resistance meant death, rebellion meant public execution, violence against owners meant retribution delivered with full force of law and community. The execution was documented in newspapers as far away as Boston and Charleston, described variously as justice served against a murderous slave or as martyrdom of a man driven to desperate resistance by intolerable oppression, depending on the political sympathies of the publication. Northern abolitionist papers used Elijah's story to illustrate the moral bankruptcy of slavery, arguing that any system which generated such desperate resistance was fundamentally evil and must be abolished. They emphasized the context of systematic cruelty that had preceded Elijah's campaign, the violence enslaved people endured daily, the lack of any legal recourse against masters who abused their power. Southern papers countered with editorials warning of the dangers posed by enslaved people who were not kept under strict control, using Elijah's actions as evidence that the slave system required more rigorous enforcement rather than reform or abolition. But the true story of Elijah's systematic campaign of retribution against plantation owners, his calculated use of the cotton press as both weapon and symbol, his success in killing 4 men before being stopped, that story was actively suppressed by Virginia authorities who understood that detailed knowledge of his methods might inspire imitation. The official records were edited, removing references to the specific manner of death and the mechanical details that might allow others to replicate his technique. Court documents that described his methods were sealed and eventually lost to archives that no one examined too closely. Newspaper accounts were deliberately vague about how the murders had been committed, referring only to tragic accidents involving cotton processing equipment without explaining the mechanical impossibility of such accidents occurring repeatedly. The suppression extended beyond written records to enforced silence within the enslaved community. Plantation owners across Virginia instituted new controls designed to prevent communication between properties, recognizing belatedly that information networks had allowed Elijah's story to spread faster than authorities could contain it. The spirituals that had referenced the cotton press and divine judgment were banned, with overseers instructed to report any enslaved person who sang such songs. Work details that brought enslaved people from different plantations into contact were restructured to minimize communication opportunities. The hiring out system was restricted, with owners reluctant to allow their workers to travel to other properties where they might encounter ideas or information that could inspire resistance. Yet the story survived through oral tradition maintained by the enslaved community, passed down through generations as cautionary tale and inspiration simultaneously. Elderly, formerly enslaved people interviewed in the early 20th century, decades after the Civil War ended slavery, remembered hearing about the man who had used the cotton press to execute justice against cruel masters. The details varied in the telling, some versions making Elijah a figure of almost supernatural strength and intelligence, others emphasizing his humanity and the desperation that drove his actions. But all versions preserved the essential truth, that an enslaved person had recognized the vulnerability even of masters who seemed all-powerful,